Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is a special Sunday episode. This is one of my most requested videos. You guys have been saying, hey, give me all the book recommendations. And so that's what I am here to do. I have 25 wonderful books for you that will help you in your process of doubting or deconstructing or deconverting. These 25 are special to me. They had a big impact. They're not the best 25 books for this, but I'm sharing what I know. There's also hundreds of other books that could have contributed to this and did for me. This list could have just as easily contained books on logic and reasoning, classic literature like from Dostoevsky, tons of philosophy. I included some, but there could have been Voltaire or Nietzsche or Kafka, etc. We could have looked at works from history and seen the atrocities in the world. We could have seen that man has been able to come up with ethics and moral systems that did not require religion. We could have gone a million directions, but we went with a few categories here, so we're going to take them in steps. And by the way, I will have each of these books listed in the description with my Amazon affiliate link, so feel free if you want to get any of these, please do so from the description down below. Just another kind of way of helping out the channel. So without any further ado, let's just dive in. I'm so excited to share these with you. The first three I have for you, I'm going to do just to get out of the way because so many of you are going to be like, oh, of course, he just went with one of the new atheists. I don't care. I love Sam Harris. Sam Harris might have been one of the most instrumental pieces in my deconversion. Sorry, it's just what it was. I know he's not perfect. I know the new atheists weren't perfect. They've also been demonized and got a lot of criticism that doesn't make sense, and it's obviously just from the Christian community. We're not going to get into new atheism, old atheism, etc. Sam Harris has had an impact. Here it is. 3 books by him really helped me out. So first, and you know what, I'll put these down because they're going to fall. 1, The Moral Landscape. And I'm not going to spend too much time on any given book, but this is Sam Harris's take on objective morals. And I don't fully agree with this book, but what it did show me and help me to understand, especially when I was at the beginning of my deconversion, is, hey, maybe there's a human way to look at this without a God being needed. It's a fascinating book regardless. Then we have The End of Faith. This is Sam after 9/11 kind of zooming out, and it specifically covers a lot of Islam, but it covers fundamentalist religions in general and makes the case that to be a true believer, to really take your holy book seriously, one would have to be fundamentalist. And here are the problems with that. When things are taken to their extremes, which by the way, religion is extreme. Just because we have watered down versions doesn't mean that religion is not extreme. The claims of religion are extreme. What religion actually asks of us is extreme. And this book covers that very well. And then he zooms in on Christianity in America, and that is Letter to a Christian Nation. I will say that if you are someone, specifically in America or in an evangelical, very fundamentalist faith, and you're thinking for yourself for the first time, and you're starting to break free of some of those thoughts, give this book a read. This was one of the first atheist books I ever read, and it started the train down the tracks, that's for sure. So thank you, Sam Harris. I don't care how much flack he gets, he will always be important to me. What do we have next here? We have Behave by one of my favorite people on the planet, Robert Sapolsky. By the way, I tried to get him on to talk about his new book, Determined, because I love it, but I was unable to do so successfully. Maybe when the channel gets bigger. This is the second book I read by Sapolsky. Behave is amazing, and what it showed me is, and I'm not going to go on a huge diatribe here, but how out of control we are of our circumstances. It's all about our behavior starts a tenth of a millisecond before we do it. And then what about a minute before? What about a year before? What about a lifetime before? What about the history of the earth and the universe? But it zooms all the way out and it shows this causal chain leading up to every little thought and action. Again, it lines up with his book on determinism as opposed to free will or compatibilism, which is a subject for another day. But this will show you, as it showed me, the realities of how little free will, even if you think there is free will, maybe it's less than what we'd imagined or it's not working in the same way. And that had major implications for me about how I viewed God, our universe, our agency, our ability to choose him, why we were just born into this religion, how so many factors are out of our control. And if that were true, the biblical story, how unfair it would be to the masses, etc. So it got me thinking down a whole different avenue that really made some issues with the Bible. Now, on their own, do any one of these books, you're just going to read it as a devout believer and now you're not going to believe? No, this was a process. This was years, and this was not a full representation for me of all the different inputs that went in. I'm imagining these objections before they come up from some of the believers. It's like, oh, you read a book, now you don't believe in free will, and so you just gave up on God. Or, oh, you read a book about something in history that was bad, so now you just don't believe in God because he's mean. Or, oh, you read something about Islam and now you're not a Christian. Like, no. this all works together. And I think we can learn something from each of these books that tells us a little bit more, that adds another piece of the puzzle into why the God of the Bible might just not be real. Caveats out of the way, let's continue. Then we have Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. So I have this kind of next to Sapolsky's book because, again, understanding our neurochemistry and what's going on. This is an incredible book on its own. Michael Pollan goes and does 7 of the main psychedelics later in his life as someone who had never done them from a pretty scholarly approach, although things really break down when you're just having these experiences. And he talks about these experiences. And I've already known that our brains, the human phenomenon of what it is to be alive, we're subject to these extreme spiritual experiences, if you want to call them that. And a lot of Christians who are stuck in their bubble and they don't understand anything about drugs or neurochemistry or even music's effect on the brain. I have a book over here, How Music Affects the Brain. Things like that become so important to understand when you've been told your whole life that when the pretty music plays just right at church and you're in some kind of a group and you're all doing the same thing and you get this feeling that's the Holy Spirit. No. That is a very common psychological phenomenon. And reading books that showcase how capable our brain is of having these otherworldly experiences, but still from a scientific level of what's actually happening in our brain, I think is one of the best ways to completely dismiss the, oh, but it feels so real, or, oh, what about someone's near-death experience, or, oh, I had someone who said they saw a vision. Like, people have been doing this since the dawn of time in all different cultures, in all different religions, for all different kinds of reasons, through all kinds of different stimuli, etc. It's not special. Christians don't have a monopoly on special feelings or spiritual experiences. They just don't. So again, that book is fantastic. When speaking of that, The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James is a wonderful look into the philosophical mind, the psychological mind of these different religious experiences that people have had or have claimed to have throughout time and throughout place. It is an incredible work of, I would consider it, philosophy. And William James, despite wherever he ended up leaning on his transcendentalist rant, is still a superhero of mine. So I would check this out as well. You guys already know what this beautiful blue book is going to be. This is God, an Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou, and I am doing a series on this book. So I'm not going to talk about it here. I put it here because I think if any of these books maybe has the chance to turn one person who's a strong believer into an atheist after one reading, it could be this book. This is the mythology of the God of the Bible. Okay, what do we have next? Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. I think we're going to be getting into some science and evolution and things like that. This book I read when I was very early in my deconversion process. And I had been so sheltered in my Christian schooling and in my friend groups and even in what I had been exposing myself to through literature or through videos online, etc., that it's embarrassing to say, but this opened my eyes to so many parts of history and evolution and science that I was simply ignorant of. And it sent me on a launching pad. So it's a short history of nearly everything. So you get these introductions essentially to these different sciences, these different avenues of our planet and our time here. And then I just said, oh, that's interesting. And I got more books on that. Oh, that's interesting. And I got more books on that. So in terms of kind of opening up the mind and expanding it, especially if you've been kind of more of a sheltered fundamentalist, wow, this book is just a great little intro. Okay, then we have Transcendence by Guy Evans. So my next 2 books are on evolution, and I think that especially coming from a young earth creationist or a more fundamentalist account, and by the way, I want to say, because I get this comment a lot, Brandon, you were stuck in some weird cult of Christianity. You were a fundamentalist. You didn't understand. You had all the wrong ideas. You didn't know how to read the Bible, whether it's coming from a Catholic, whether it's coming from a progressive. I'm told all the time that I simply have all of my basis wrong. Guys, I spent years after being this fundamentalist that I grew up as, being in this more progressive mindset. Most of my adult Christian life, I was just like a normal Christian and had done away with so much of that. But that doesn't mean that these books didn't help me start breaking stuff more down that I was still holding on to, that I still had issues with. So again, someone that grew up not being even exposed to evolution, except to say it was a demonic lie, these books blew my mind when I finally freed myself to see the realities of our world. And this one, Why Evolution is True by Jerry A. Coyne, this is probably the best case for evolution that I've read. I have maybe 20 books on that shelf about evolution. This is probably the best at convincing someone that evolution is true and why we can believe it. And then this one was a gorgeous, unique read explaining evolution still, but through a lot more of the questions that someone might have. So it breaks it down into 4 categories: fire, language, beauty, and time. And if you have an interest in evolution at all, this is a must. I never see people talk about this book. I never see this book recommended. This is an unsung hero. So those are 2 books on evolution that I would recommend to get the wheels turning. Let's move these down here and keep talking. What do we have next? We have Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I love this book. Once again, this book introduced me to a ton of concepts that I knew either very little about or that I had previously rejected. This is a history of mankind, and it gets into religion, and it gets into evolution, and it gets into what it is to be a member of this species, and so much of this information. Again, I think what allows someone who is stuck in any cult or any religion, especially more fundamentally, but in general, is a new perspective. Getting their mind opened a little bit, becoming more aware, getting more perspectives. And Sapiens does that very, very, very well. Then we have Cosmos by Carl Sagan. Same thing. Let's expand. I could have listed 20 books on space. I could have talked about the microwave cosmic background. Afterglow of Creation is a great little book if you want to read it. I guess we're up to 26 books now. Plus I have a bonus book for you at the end, by the way. Max Tegmark's Mathematical Universe. Sean Carroll's The Big Picture. Brian Greene's Until the End of Time. Carlo Rovelli's The Order of Time. All these books on physics and mathematics and sciences and the universe, they just, again, zoom out. Let's look at this. And you begin to realize how ridiculous it is that a God would care so much about this tiny little planet that is not the center of its solar system, that is not anything special except the third rock from the sun in one little solar system of one little galaxy. And again, just getting this zoomed out perspective of what one might be able to expect from the God of all creation versus a God of the Bible that cares so much about the stupidest and pettiest and little things and can't find a way to give us free will without an immense amount of suffering and can't find a way to redeem us without killing his son and using blood magic, etc. A dose of reality is what Cosmos is. And again, good perspective. Then we have, then we're going to get into 2 books by Dan Barker. Dan Barker is one of my favorites. He probably represents my journey the most. He was as in as you could be. I say often a quote, if anyone was a Christian, I was a Christian. I got that from Dan Barker. He understands. He was a worship leader. He was a missionary. He was a street evangelist. He believed in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. He felt the Holy Spirit. He was a part of faith healings, part of the tongues movement. Again, everything that any Christian says, well, some things in the Bible don't make sense, but man, when I have this experience, when I do this, when I've seen this, and it's broken down so well in his first book here, Godless. This is his personal experience of his deconversion. This is his deconversion story, and it's fascinating. I remember back when Skinny Brandon was still doing endurance athletics, which I need to get back into. You guys are going to see me lose a lot of weight over the next year. But I went out for my first double century. That's a 200-mile bike ride. It took me 17 hours. And so I loaded up with audiobooks and I put this on. And I was very heavily doubting. I had so many questions. I was still at that time telling my wife, like, it's not like I'm going to become an atheist, but something's wrong here. And I was on this long bike ride, and I don't know how long the audiobook was, probably 4 or 5 hours. And I listened to the whole thing. And by the end of it, it's not that he had convinced me. And it wasn't even that right there I said, oh, I'm an atheist. But I remember it being a very large tipping point for me where I was like, man, we really can be so wrong about this, despite all the evidence we think we have from personal experience or historicity of the Bible, etc. Like, he just covers everything here. And it was eye-opening and almost a permission. This is something I hear from a lot of you, like, Brandon, your channel has allowed me to really come to terms with what I think I already knew. This book kind of, in a way, and I don't want to be too hyperbolic, gave me the permission to accept what was happening in my life. So for that reason, he's high up on my list, and I'd encourage you to check that out if you're in the middle of your own deconstruction or deconversion. His other book that I read, and it's funny because I did both of these on ultra events. I did a run down in Utah that was 44 miles through the mountains, tons of elevation, absolutely gorgeous. And I listened to this entire book during it. This is God, the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. His goal in this book is he takes a quote that Richard Dawkins made. In fact, I'll read it to you really quick. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully. And Dan Barker said, you missed a few. He adds a few to his book. And then for each of those categories, list every single verse in the Bible that he can find that matches onto that. Now, I will say that some verses I think aren't correct. I think some verses he took out of context. None of these books are perfect. Just like my channel's not perfect. But it doesn't mean that there's not a vast amount of information that is correct, that is awfully damning to Christianity. So, Dan Barker's books, absolutely phenomenal. What do we have next? Breaking the Spell by Daniel Dennett. I think he was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for the New Atheist. Let's see. I can never remember this whole list. It's Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, I think Daniel Dennett, and Richard Dawkins. Why can I never remember those 4? Anyways, I know I'm talking about New Atheist again, but Breaking the Spell is a wonderful scientific look at religion from an evolutionary basis to help us understand why we have it, which many of these other books do as well. But Daniel's writing with the intent, purpose to show how faulty we are in our minds of accepting this information that has been passed down from an origin that we can no longer relate to. So, Breaking the Spell, Daniel Dennett, absolutely fantastic. Oh, one of my personal favorites of all time, Bertrand Russell. Read everything that Russell wrote. If you're into philosophy, check out it's a very short book, The Problems on Philosophy. Why I Am Not a Christian was actually a lecture that he gave. It was a series of lectures. I think it was 3 parts. And it's phenomenal, right? If Bertrand Russell was around doing his thing today, he'd have a YouTube channel, and it would be what I would hope similar to mine. Or I should say, he is what I would aspire to be. He so eloquently and accurately explains the issues with this religion in a way that, even for how old and the kind of advanced philosophy and intellectual that he was, is so digestible, so understandable, and is filled with all of those, oh, that makes sense, bam, like a light bulb turning on. If I had to pick one individual that I think has the most potential to be as influential as possible at helping someone out of their religion, Bertrand Russell is up at the very tippy top. Okay, The Case Against the Case for Christ by Robert Price. Now, the funny thing is, and I am not a biblical scholar. I know more than the average layman, but way less than your typical biblical scholar. So when it comes to people like Bart Ehrman or Robert Price or Francesca Stavrakopoulou, I'm a little bit like, okay, they're scholars, but I also see bias, or I see that maybe other scholars believe differently, etc. So I don't want to get into a thing where I'm trying to make anyone that is a biblical scholar like they're always right about everything all the time. But what this particular book helped me do is, again, it's funny because I'm flooded with memories for each of these. I remember my last desperate grab at religion was reading a ton of apologetic books, and ones that I hadn't before. I'd been pretty into like the church fathers. I had read a lot of C.S. Lewis and things like that, but I started being like, all right, what are the modern guys saying? So I read Paul Copan, I read Frank Turek, I read The Case for Christ. And I was so desperate not to lose this religion and everything that went with it, that I let that book really influence me. And I fell subject to so many of what I see now, horrible cases that he's making in The Case for Christ. Well, the apostles were all willing to die. That's got to mean something. Or how we can know the gospels are true and accurate, and why all of the contradictions in them don't actually mean anything bad. It's what you would expect it. All that stuff, right? It's ridiculous to the highest degree. And thankfully, and I remember I was still praying at this point. After I read that book, I found this book, The Case Against the Case for Christ. And I remember like praying still about if I should read this book. Like, look at that. Clearly, I knew there was going to be information in here that was going to maybe potentially disprove what my last hopes were hanging on. And I'm praying for guidance from the Lord on if I should be exposed to a book. Like, it's this is a few years ago, you guys. It's crazy. But thankfully, I did read this book. And I'm going to do another series when I'm done. I need to get through some of my other series where I compare the case for Christ against the case for Christ. That's hard to say. And show you just point by point why that book fails. So excellent, excellent book. Okay, next we have Hitchens. I don't think any list like this from any atheist channel or whatever would be complete if you didn't have one book from Christopher Hitchens. This one is God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything. I read this pretty early on, and it was an eye-opener to me at the time. We have so many different people watching. This might seem really basic to some of you. And Hitch does a lot of things incorrectly, by the way. As much as I love him, as much as he helped me, as funny as he is, as quick-witted, and as amazing as his quips are, he wasn't the most honest debater. I think there were a lot of tactics, a lot of avoiding and dodging, a lot of getting out of tricky spots with getting the audience on your side or just railing against how evil this God would be. And there's a time and place for some of that, for sure. And some of it was just stupid and not worthwhile. But Hitch is amazing. Christopher Hitchens is a gem. And this book does make the case similar to Dan Barker's God's Most Unpleasant Character in All of Fiction about if this God were real, like, what are we doing here? Like, why would we want this? Do you guys read your Bible? And he also covers really well the history of religion. So again, you could read anything by Christopher Hitchens. I would also recommend, just in general, as a thinker, the Letters to a Young Contrarian that he did. Excellent. Okay, now we have two books by Reza Aslan. I'm going to put these down because they're starting to fall over. We have God, A Human History, and Jesus of Nazareth, Zealot. I've also heard critiques on these books that some things might not be perfect, but if you want to get a history of God, like this was the book for me before God, An Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou that was like, whoa, like, here's the real origins for this biblical God, and this is pretty crazy. And it's not just Yahweh in this Bible. It is kind of comparative religion, but it does focus a lot on the biblical God. And again, zooming out, perspective, things I say on my channel all the time. It's fascinating, it's well done, it's interesting, and even though it's amazing, I would still put Zealot ahead of it. This book, and I've read many like it, and there are some better than it that I could put here, but I'm talking about the books that personally influenced me here. This was my first book reading about the historical figure of Jesus. I guess that Robert Price's book, The Case Against the Case for Christ, does it, although he's one of those that gets almost into mythicism, which I don't think is necessarily accurate. This was a really good look at, okay, let's just assume Jesus existed, and let's just assume that some of the things that have been attributed to him, we can believe. Some of the stories from the Gospels, and he even looks at some of the Gnostic tales, etc. What would this man, if he's just a man, what would his goal have been, right? If he's part of the Jewish community and he's growing up and he's hearing about the Messianic prophecies and he's reading the Old Testament and he's under this kind of an influence, and he's here to do what? He's here for the Jews. And what he probably expected or intended would have been revolution of some kind, not this peaceful sacrifice to atone for our sins, right? Taking the mythology and the lore out of the Jesus story and showing us from a historical perspective what we could have imagined Jesus to really be more like, how he thought of himself, what he thought his mission was, etc. It's really interesting. Again, I'm not claiming 100% accuracy, but we don't have that from the Gospels either. So it's just showing the other side. And again, I just think it's absolutely fantastic. Do we want to try to get this stack going? All right, I have 5 books left. Bear with me here. In Numeracy by John Allen Paulus. He also has a book similar to the ones we just covered called Irreligion. I'd also recommend that to you. This book, though, is about why are we so bad with numbers? Why are we so bad with probabilities? Why do we think coincidences mean so much? It's our failure to understand math, basic, simple probabilities mixed with our irrational brains that produce such horrendous results in the world, religion being one of them. And this book really helped me start to wrap my head around the beginnings of logic and math and science, etc. So cool little book, I think very underrated. Similarly, we have 2 other books that zoomed my mind out. Again, I'm going to keep using that term. We have Beyond Infinity by Eugenia Cheng, and we have A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen L. Peck. This is fiction. This is really, really good nonfiction. So we'll start with Beyond Infinity. I've read a good handful of books on infinity. I talked about this when I did my Heaven video on the failure to imagine what actually never-ending infinity eternity really is. From the examples, from the thought experiments, This book helps one understand these concepts really well. And whether you're thinking about heaven or hell, the injustice of hell, or the ridiculousness of the concept of heaven where we can't sin but supposedly still have free will and it goes on forever and no one ever breaks it ever, even though someone broke it as soon as they could with Satan and someone then broke it as soon as they could on earth with Adam, sure, whatever. But this book really helped me with that. And then A Short Stay in Hell, I mean, I did a 50-minute book review when I still had my old book review channel. It is a story of all different kinds of hell, and it plays off a wonderful short story by Jorge Luis Borges, which is the Library of Babel. And in this particular hell, this gentleman, it's not eternal. He has to find the book of his life that is perfect. And it plays off the numbers of how many books could be written when you consider the alphabet and all the different combinations. If something can be written, it was, right? So you could have the entire story of your life, but there was a comma missing on page 982. That wasn't it. The vast majority of books in that library are nonsense. Getting a single sentence is an amazing find. And so they have to find the book of their life perfectly, and then they'll be done with their hell. And the book does such a good job through math and through playing off Borges' Library of Babel that you understand more than ever before, speaking for myself, how long, how insane the concept of forever is. And I remember finishing that book, still a Christian, and thinking Christians don't take hell seriously enough. And not like they don't have the correct fear of hell, but we have a justice problem. There cannot be a good, wonderful, loving, just God that really would put people in hell for believing the wrong thing, knowing the wrong thing, committing the same sins as everyone that's in heaven, just not getting the right scapegoat. It can't be. I think so many times Christians don't have a good understanding of this stuff. And I'm not trying to say I'm smarter than them. I'm trying to say they just haven't been exposed to it. And so they hear, oh, the two options after death are heaven or hell. And hell is just eternal torment and heaven is eternal paradise. Like, let's choose heaven. It's so much more than that. It's just ridiculous. Okay, last two books, Bart Ehrman. Many of you know Bart, so I don't need to do a whole lot, but he was another wake-up call for me for my Christian life. The first two books that I read of his, I've read all of his now, I think, is Jesus Interrupted and Misquoting Jesus. So again, kind of like the Zealot book, getting a more historical picture of this Jesus and understanding, especially with Misquoting Jesus, the canonization process and the copyist errors and the formation of the Bible and what was added and what's been taken away and how problematic that is, etc. These books just open the eyes to the reality of the religion that so many of us took so seriously for so long. So these are my 25 books. I also listed a few other books throughout the course of going through this. All the books that were talked about today will be in the description down below for you to buy. There is one more book, and this isn't going to be a shock, and I'm being a little bit silly here, but the main book for sure that helped me deconvert is the Bible. Hands down. And I'm embarrassed at just how long it took. I know this book, and yet it still took me 30 years to swim against the current of my indoctrination to figure out how deceived and manipulated I was by these words. This book by itself would be just another fairy tale, just another myth, just another book of insane things to actually believe. Talking snakes and donkeys, spiritual warfare, hidden realms, blood magic, ridiculous rituals to communicate with the dead. Everything that Christians mock in every other religion is found here, typically more so. And then, of course, in addition to the impossible things, the ridiculous things, the mythological things, the incorrect things, the incorrect science, the incorrect history that is on full display for anyone that is willing to be objective as they read it, we have all the moral problems. A book that when you read it without your Christian lenses on is undeniably wicked. Reading this book was the number one reason I had to say, nope, it can't work, it doesn't work, and if it did work, it would be horrendous. Challenge yourself to look objectively at this religion. Again, I started the video by listing so many other things that you could read to get some perspective on this religion, and one of them that I forgot too was other holy books, comparative religions, right? And then you start seeing things. You read the New Testament, oh, Jesus is this ethical mastermind. And then you read the Tao Te Ching, or you read Meditations, or the Enchiridion, etc. And you're like, oh, there's other good wisdom out there. By the way, watch this episode. But I digress. I've been speaking for a long time here. Thank you for putting up with me, introducing you to 25, maybe close to, 35 with all the other books that we mentioned. If you are into books and you want to see more of this on my channel, would you let me know? And also, are there any other books you would recommend to someone on the fence deconverting, doubting, or deconstructing? Thanks for being here. I'll see you Tuesday with a new Tuesday Takedown. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, Karolina, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.